all of us like to feel like we belong. It's human nature. It's part of our cultural DNA. And universities have long been positioned as places where people can find themselves, can grow as individuals, and belong to a community of like-minded people. Feeling like you belong at university is also associated with better performance, with better mental health, better outcomes. So it's really, really critical. But the theory is a little bit more straightforward than it is to actually put into practice. So I remember from my own time as part of the leadership team at the University of Central Lancashire that belonging and identity were really significant obstacles when it came to wrestling with big issues like student experience and attainment. And that's because large numbers of the students that we dealt with were residential students that were living away for the first time, so suffered seriously from homesickness. A significant proportion of them suffered homesickness, and we've got a session later today that might explore that in a little bit more detail. But also there were lots, the majority of students, in fact, were commuters. They had other responsibilities. They were working. So once their lectures were over, once they'd finished their sessions on campus, they needed to disappear. So being engaged as an 18-year-old straight out of school might wasn't part of their existence. As values-driven organisations, it's really possible for universities to help people rally around common principles. I think we heard that very much from Robert's discussion this morning about how the 4 principles of his strategy were really latched onto, were co-created by the community at Reading. And from the bit of work that I've done with Reading recently, that sense of community was absolutely palpable in the work we did supporting the brand. So the essence, the brand essence that staff and students came up with together was centred on that sense of community, or indeed, as they articulated, being a community of communities. They articulated it as making a better world together. And that sense of togetherness was really the strongest thing of all. Just before the pandemic, Accenture undertook a big study, 30,000 consumers, and they asked people what they identified with when they're dealing with brands. And they found that 62% of people want companies to take a stand on current relevant issues that they themselves connect with, like sustainability, like transparency and fair employment practices. The closer a company's purpose aligns with their own, the better. And that's really, really straightforward for universities because we are values-driven organisations. It's probably the first step in building long-lasting, authentic relationships, essential to creating that sense of collective belonging. But it's more difficult, I think, for universities to actually put that into practice because we are hampered by often dispersed structures, devolved decision-making, the kinds of things we were hearing in the questions from the floor this morning. So, engaging staff and students in everything you do is key, but it's hard. It's really, really difficult. You've got to bring people along with you, and as Robert was so keen to emphasise, you have to do it consistently. If we think about who's responsible for delivering that sense of belonging in universities, the answer is everyone. It's all of us. It doesn't matter whether you are part of the leadership, whether you work in HR, estates, whether you're an academic. All of us are responsible. But without doubt, I think the global COVID-19 pandemic has made the challenge of delivering on the promise of belonging far, far more difficult. So psychologists have written a lot about how the physical disconnect created by the lockdowns has created a belonging deficit. Yes, technology has been fantastic at keeping us connected, but at a more superficial level. So as we emerge from the pandemic, how can we rebuild that sense of togetherness that's so important and so powerful when we get things right? How can we make our campus communities strong again? I've got a series of questions that I'm going to kick off with to our panel. But I do want you to be thinking about questions that you'd like them to answer, because I'm going to come to you shortly. But if I can first start off and go to Sheila.
For me, I wouldn't talk about it in terms of tactics so much. I think it's actually far more about harnessing the talent and the creativity of our communities. And I think the role of universities is very much there to create those opportunities. For me, I think the first theme that really binds us together as a university community is our values. Our values are absolutely central. And at Queen Mary we have 5 values, of which inclusion is one. And I can not think of any other value other than inclusion and inclusivity is sitting at the very heart of this whole concept of how do you rekindle that sense of community. So I think through inclusive behaviours, and I can expand on that later, but that would be my first thought. My second thought about community is sense of place. Now that can obviously be geographical, it can obviously be virtual. But one of the things that I'd really like to share with you is that we have just recently refurbished a building which is available for use by professional services and academic colleagues. And what it comprises is an enormous array, a wide range of phenomenally flexible places. And these places feel very funky, they feel very new, and they're all supported by technology. And what people are saying is that it's afforded them the opportunity to come in and interact with a whole variety of different colleagues whom they haven't really had the chance to meet before because we were all dispersed around different campuses and in different buildings and offices. And people have found that really liberating, but it's really generated ideas and a sense of momentum and enthusiasm. So I think geography is important in the physical sense. Place is important in the virtual sense as well. And I think we've seen a real shift in culture. We now don't have the kind of 2-tier systems of academics can choose where they work and professional services staff have to be on campus all the time. We are breaking that down through new models of hybrid working, which I'm sure we're still evolving. We're at a very early stage of that. But there are wonderful EDI opportunities. We're moving away from that awful sense of presenteeism. And what we're doing is we're moving into new space that says you can be effective working in different places, whether that's physically on campus, whether that's somewhere else. The important thing is we are still there to support the business needs, but through a wide variety of different models of flexible working. So really promoting positive flexible working and how it can make us successful as universities. I think the other thing that I'm sure we are all experiencing is that wonderful opportunity for celebration and events. Coming together today is wonderful, but we're also running events to celebrate, for example, the last 2 years of academic promotions. We've been running these events and people have really welcomed them and valued them because for once all their work is being recognised and they're getting to meet people from across the campus who also were promoted. We've got an awards ceremony in a couple of weeks' time. So I think let's not forget the value of celebration. Because we do tremendous work at universities, so let's celebrate that. And I think finally for me, it's really harnessing that whole concept of peer group support. I was delighted. Our student union are doing amazing work on peer-led team learning. So using the talents of our students to be peer group leaders for more junior students. To really sort of share expertise and experience and get that sort of cross-fertilisation across disciplines. And in the staff arena, we're doing that with professional networks. And again, the opportunity for professionals to come together, and that can be academic communities of practice as well as professional, to come together, to share their expertise. It's a wonderfully empowering experience. It's tapping into talent that before was just sort of there, but we weren't really using it or harnessing it in any particular way. And it is building tremendous communities. So I think, what I would say is that let's move away from old, rigid, very inflexible models to the art of the possible, to the art of the flexible, to what is now possible in this post-COVID world. And I think I would just end by saying, universities are here to sort of push the frontiers of knowledge. So why don't we use that idea, that sort of those ideas, the talent that we all have within our organisations, to really build inclusive communities in a way that is a new conception of what a community can be. So that's.
Thank you, Sheila. I mean, it's great to hear those thoughts. And we heard earlier from Robert about the importance of culture in his leadership. and he talked about communication. So, Fee, that's your job, isn't it, at Reading? You're there supporting Robert to do that communications job across the institution.
I was 25 at the start of 2020.
Absolutely. So, I guess my question to you is, it's a huge agenda, and it takes a huge amount of time, investment from across the whole institution. The cascade, as we heard earlier, is really, really important. How central do you see communications and a shared responsibility for communications across the whole institution? And I'm really interested in perhaps unpicking a question that we touched on earlier. You've set a precedent. Meeting those expectations is a big deal. How sustainable do you think that is, and to what extent is communication central to that?
Thank you. I'd like to start by also calling out our head of communications in the room, Vicky Pearson. So some of what I'm going to say is entirely her work, and I'm going to pass it as my own, unashamedly. But thanks to her for allowing me and Robert to both do that a bit this morning. I think the key thing is that, and I find myself referring to the past 18 months almost constantly at the moment, but there is a truth in the fact that over the past 18 months there has been a significant realisation and renewed understanding of the role of communications, the critical role of communications, and what can go wrong when you get it wrong. And I think that has had an impact on how we have worked with our senior leadership and with our colleagues across the institution. And it's had pros and cons, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I think what the last 18 months has taught us positively is that the important role that communications can have, particularly when it is all that you do have. And for a chunk of time, that is all that we have had. We've only been able to engage with our communities through a variety of methods, but nonetheless they have been communications rather than in-person activities of engagement in a different way. So I think when we haven't been able to be together physically, that communications has had to fill that gap, and it has been hard work and time consuming. But what I think, and Joel kind of used the phrase that we do use at Reading, which is that sense of community of communities, that what we do try to do is follow Robert's lead on that sense of devolved leadership, in that communications, whilst can be set in terms of tone and style, centrally linked to brand, which, as Robert said, was a community-led piece of work, it has to be based on trust, and we know that we have to work with our colleagues across the institution to ensure that the messages and the tone and the style are translated and work across the piece. What I would also say just about that reflection on the last 18 months is that openness and transparency, as you heard from Robert, is absolutely critical. Because of the work that we did with him at the very beginning of his tenure around the strategy, I think it addresses the question from a colleague from King's actually about how, if he were to leave, would that be embedded still? Because everybody embraced it, that notion, and really sees the value in it, it already is really very much a value that is shared and is driven by colleagues on a daily basis. It's not something that you see from him and not from anybody else. So it definitely feels like there's a sense there. And I think COVID and the being thrown online and being in each other's houses and homes has only strengthened that, actually, because we've had to share more, we've had to be more open and honest and intimate, not in that way, because of the nature of where we've been. And so actually I think that's lent itself only to strengthen that position for us as an institution, I'm sure for us all even more, and I think something that we're all really keen to not lose as we come back. But what we have lost is how we use communication and engagement when we are together physically, and getting that balance back, exactly as Sheila was saying, to being back on campus and creating that sense of embracing the best of both is something that I think is a challenge for us all. So going to the sort of sense of that, practically speaking, how do you maintain a sense of keeping things at the level of engagement that we have? Robert was right. We have maintained a level of engagement, particularly with our colleagues, our staff body, of 2 weekly engagements online with 300 to 700, sometimes more, at each of those sessions. And he is also right in what you said earlier, it takes a heck of a lot of work. Because when we were in the heat of the pandemic, the theme picked itself. We knew what we were talking about. It was a different angle, a different aspect. But that's not the case now. And to keep those things relevant and real, it takes a lot of work from our team, working with colleagues from across the institution to make sure that we're showcasing relevant, meaningful pieces of work that we want to engage people with for the right reasons. And I think for me, the main message is making sure that there's relevance in what we're doing.
Yeah.
We could communicate at the frequency that we've been communicating for the last 18 months, every minute of every day, but we should only be doing it when we've got something that's worth sharing and that where we're going to do something with the outcomes of that engagement. One of the, I suppose it's a marker of success, one of the big challenges that we now face is that because there has been good engagement with the centrally led communication that has happened, we find ourselves in demand a lot for every single project that's happening across every single bit of the university, which is brilliant. That's exactly what we want, but we can't do it all. And the most important thing is we shouldn't be doing the same level of communication and engagement for every single project. We should only do it where there is a real meaningful reason for that engagement, because we're going to do something with the outcome. And that, I think, is the one message that I would ensure for us all, that we there's no point in engaging for the sake of it. And the piece of advice I think we find ourselves giving, and Vicky's nodding, which is a good sign, that we're giving ourselves and our colleagues and our senior colleagues particularly on an almost daily basis, is absolutely communication and engagement, and all of the wide range of projects that we've got going on now is really important. But what are we going to do with the outcome, and how are we going to ensure that we're listening and doing something? Because if we're not going to do anything, if we don't have the resource to do anything with the outcomes of those communications, then we should be doing something different to engage our colleagues. So I think practically speaking, we shouldn't underestimate how much work is involved in continuing with a different level and a different style of communication on an ongoing basis, and resourcing our teams adequately to do that is a challenge. It's one that we're facing, and I'm sure you all are too. But ensuring relevance, ensuring meaningfulness, and that's the same for student engagement as much as it is for our colleague engagement too. And when it comes to being back on campus, I, much like Sheila, feel that sense of celebration. We're really, really looking forward to hosting our first graduation ceremonies in 2 weeks' time, and I think our community are too. And celebration and bringing people together for things that they all care about, I think is going to be a really important part, which is equally about our communication as much as anything else around strategy or project work is too.
Terrific, thank you, Fiona. Lots resonated with me there, and in particular the authenticity. Don't communicate just for the sake of communicating. Only do it if it's meaningful, and you're going to do something as a result of that. That sense that Robert was talking about earlier of listening, engaging, even when there's challenge, but then doing something about it. If you don't do something about it, it rings hollow very, very quickly, and your strategy disappears, doesn't it? We hear a lot at these sessions from university leaders, but it's great to have the opportunity to hear from a student today. And Shamima, you had a really interesting time, didn't you, as the president of the union at Queen Mary, because you were doing that role during the pandemic. So no mean feat. I'd be really interested to hear what you think matters most to students when it comes to a feeling of belonging to a community at university, and also I guess you're well networked with other student unions around the country. You know the good and the bad. You hear the stories. What tips have you got from the student perspective for university leaders in the room? What can they hear from you that will make the greatest impact in their engagement work with the student body to create that sense of belonging?
Thank you. I'm quite nervous to speak, I have to admit. But to answer the question, I think one of the key things is to understand students, which I know people say a lot of, but it's not as easy as saying that we just need to understand students. It's more about consulting students and getting feedback. And I think an example I'd like to give would be recently we went through a democracy review within our students' union, so we changed our entire structure of how we represent students. And the way we did that was through student consultation, and we wanted to find out how students identify with their university, what makes them connect with their university. And the results were, as we anticipated, was through their schools and faculties. And their entire connection to the wider university was through their schools and faculties, which is what we needed to strengthen and represent more of. And I think it's important to identify and acknowledge and respect the fact that those individual identities are what allows students to connect to the wider university brand. So it's really important to find a way of bringing that under one umbrella, which doesn't necessarily mean one brand. It's more about the values, the culture, and that one experience, which is defined by the quality of experience that students have, because you don't want students having one experience in one school that is vastly different from the experience in a different school, which can be a lot more negative or positive. And I think that experience is what defines that. And the second point would be the fact that we have a lot of subcultures within university. We have lots of smaller communities that are we often see through societies and student groups and sports societies, and students tend to identify quite strongly with the societies they belong to, or the cultural societies, or the sport group they belong to. Acknowledging the fact that university life is more than academic progression is really important, and the SU plays a big part in connecting with those communities. And I think what's important for university leaders is to understand the SU's role in connecting with those smaller groups that we don't often get engagement from centrally. So supporting that work, supporting the initiatives, campaigns that students do themselves through SUs is a really important step in supporting those communities. And in terms of lessons and tips from the wider student union networks, so last year we created the Aldwych Group, which was a collection of Russell Group University presidents coming together to talk through COVID, support each other, create a network so that we can all address similar issues. And I think one of the biggest things we learned was the fact that we all had similar values that students have across the country, and what needed to be happening was that university leaders needed to align themselves with those values in order for students to feel like they are represented by their university, they feel like they belong and they can connect. So I think that's really important, is to understand the values of students, the cultures within university, and respect those cultures and try and bring them together without trying to diminish their identities. And I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons.
Thanks, Shamima. Really interesting to hear you talk about the importance of the extracurricular, the wider part of student life. It's all too easy in this post-fees world that we live in at university now. It's not just about the academic qualification. It's that it has so much more potential for those that want to engage. Now, that's not everybody, but many people will want that sense of wider connection to the community of students around them. And really interesting to hear you talk about the importance of values underpinning experience across a university, because there's lots of different subcultures, right, absolutely, but ensuring that they're all true to the same set of values and that there's a consistent approach, even if there's some nuancing at a local level. The consistency of approach, I think, is really important to a good student experience. So that's terrific, thank you. The civic universities agenda was a very loud voice before we went into the pandemic, and I thought it was interesting that at the recent party conferences that started coming back again as a policy issue, and you've got the likes of Lord Willits in the fringes saying that actually, advocating perhaps for new universities in towns that would really benefit from an institution, and that's because universities are seen as being of value to community, the wider community, socio-economic value, a whole range of different things, and very powerful for what they can do for their places. Would you say that that role of civic anchor is the key policy lever, Debbie, for universities to be thinking about going forward? Is that going to resonate when university leaders are talking to policymakers, to politicians about their role, or should we be looking to other key policy drivers to think in terms of university community?
It depends on the politician. We are, yeah. I mean, we're all waiting for quite a lot to come out of Westminster in the next. Well, we're here the next couple of weeks, but we've been hearing that for a long time now. So, yes, early Christmas presents could be on the agenda, but we don't know for sure. I think one thing to say about government agenda is that there isn't going to be a very kind of neat and tidy line drawn between, for example, the Levelling Up white paper that we're expecting and universities' role as civic anchors. The government isn't going to do that work, so I think it is for universities to draw those lines and to kind of and to represent that viewpoint back to government. And I think that is perhaps more challenging than it might appear on first blush. I'm thinking of a Public First poll that came out this week, which was really interesting, looking at the idea of civic pride. And finding that the idea of wounded civic pride resonates really, really strongly with those groups and communities who are actually the least likely to engage with higher education, the working class communities. And I think there's clearly going to be, and I would expect to see in the Levelling Up white paper quite a lot around R&D, innovation, the role of universities in economic growth, and kind of creating a sort of contributing to those local identities. But I think universities are going to have to work quite hard to draw those lines between that sort of work and that broader sense of civic pride in things like football clubs and high streets. And we've seen some universities begin that work, and I think that's something that's going to be continually important. But I think there's other things, there's other links to make between the broad policy agenda and belonging on campus, because I mean the other sorts of things we're seeing coming out of government. And I think are probably pretty important conversations. We saw the IFS and Sutton Trust data this week that looked at social mobility and broke it down at subject level. And we know that the graduate outcomes work, although subject F is off the agenda, that there is still that sense of these things need to be looked at subject and course level. And there's all kinds of complexities around the kind of quality of the data that is produced by doing it that way. But I think what we're seeing is this shift to thinking about quality at subject level, and building on what Shamima was saying. Actually, the need to look at it through that lens, I think, is going to be increasingly pressing, because we know that is where students experience their sense of belonging within their subject, within their peer groups in that way, as well as through their extracurricular engagement as well. And I think for universities that are looking, for example, to implement as part of the skills agenda, diversification of qualifications, trying to think about what that looks like for diverse qualifications and perhaps a more diverse student group. And how to maintain that consistency and sense of all being one institution, albeit with very kind of diverse set of provision, I think is going to be quite a big challenge as well, and something that is probably worth, particularly where those perhaps new diversifying qualifications are serving local communities in different ways. I think that's probably quite an important conversation to be having with local policymakers as well.
Absolutely, really interesting perspective there, and I'm sure that we'll get some more questions on the policy aspects when we go out to the floor. But one more question for our panellists before I do go to the floor. And living up to the promise, meeting expectations, is absolutely essential for universities to be truly authentic. So Samita, you're at the sharp end. Your role, leading student recruitment at the University of Derby. How important do you think it is during that student recruitment phase to engage prospects in belonging, in almost onboarding before they arrive? And how do you also work with colleagues in other areas so that once they're there, once students have actually arrived at the university, colleagues from across the institution can make the reality live up to the promise?
Yeah, really tough on that one. If anyone's got the answer, let me know. I think for us, it's really around starting at the beginning of the journey, making sure that those areas are involved. So at Derby, one of the things that we've done is when you look at something, quite straightforward like an open day, is to make sure that it is truly open and they've got access to all of those areas. And it was interesting what Shamima was saying about subcultures, because I think that's really, really important. That sense of belonging, that sense of feeling like they can spend more than 3 or more years at a place that either they're, previously never been to. There's a lot of universities that have students that are first generation going to university, so their parents, their carers are also nervous. And in preparation for this today, I was talking to one of our union officers, and he made an interesting point. And I think we all know this, but universities can alienate without even trying. So the way he described it was the language that's used, the Vice-Chancellor, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, this academic, the lecture, the seminar, also our buildings, our physical space. You're in the wrong building, your course is over there, you're not on this site, you need to go to B0243, where's that? It's on the lower ground floor, I'm on the ground floor, no, you need to go to the lower ground floor. And all of that can really alienate students and make them feel that actually I don't belong here, I don't get this, this is alien to me. So I thought that was a really interesting point. So what I think that we can do as marketing, recruitment teams, is to kind of bridge that gap, that feeling like you are an alien somewhere, and allowing that kind of open, that transparency when people kind of set foot onto your campus, but through every single touch point. And I think that point that you made, Joel, about that promise to be, that sold like kind of pre-enrollment, I think it is that every single touch point. It might be the email that they send in. Does that align to the warm academic that they met on the open day? The phone call that they make, does that align to the warm academic that they met at the open day? Because if all those things don't align up, that's when that kind of authenticity starts diminishing for them.
Yeah.
So I think having that common goal, I think is really important. And I think that through the last 18 months, a lot of organisations, a lot of universities would have set up like task and finish groups, gold, silver, bronze, those sorts of things. And actually, in our organisation, we've kept some of that, because what it allows is that kind of agile way of working, to be able to respond quickly, where previously that would have taken months, years to get some of that stuff off the ground. And I'm going to use another Olympic reference, because it's about passing the baton on without dropping it. I think that's really key. You're in a bit of a relay, so that student recruitment journey is around making sure that transition is smooth as it possibly can be, because that's where that's going to feel authentic. It's going to feel that actually people care, it's valued, there's that sense of that they want me, and they're genuine about it. The other kind of element of it is what's the values of the organisation as well. So does that align to my way of thinking? So this generation, Gen Z, and the generation that's following them, they are bothered about causes. What's the agenda in terms of sustainability? What's their commitment to equality, diversity? How are they going to respond to the things that are coming on in the news, the things that matter to me? Are they using plastic cups? All of those sorts of things as well. So, beyond the course, which is the point that Shamima was making as well, it's much more than that. It's that whole offering. And actually it could be one thing that can really put them off, that kind of diminishes that feeling of actually this place isn't aligned to me. I don't feel like I could feel comfortable here, or somewhere that wants me. So I think that's another element that universities need to think about, that whole package, that whole offering. Because it could be that one thing that makes or breaks it for a student. Yeah,
absolutely. And that sense that actually at every touch point being true to your values. That's really powerful, and terrific to hear that you've got the agility through having through keeping those task finish groups going to respond to the big change agenda. Because I think the pandemic was wonderful in demonstrating just what we could do as university leaders. We managed to turn things around pretty quickly through absolute necessity, but we proved that we could do it, and do it with pace, do it with alacrity. So keeping those frameworks in place to continue the change journey at Derby is really, really fascinating. Thank you.